Hey everyone, Zack Albetta here for OnlineDrummer.com, and this video is going to be devoted to discussing some Latin styles. And before I get started, I want to say that everything I'm going to be talking about is outlined in much greater detail in a great book by a man named Doug Allwater, who was the man that I learned all this stuff from. The book is called Essential Latin Styles for Drum Set. And if you go pick it up, there's lots of history about Latin styles, where they came from, how they melded with other styles, the instrumentation, and just a lot of discussion about authentic Latin playing. And in addition, all of the stuff that I'm going to be playing here is notated out in that book. So you can go to dougallwater.com, that's DOUGAUWARTER.com, and get that book. I highly recommend it. So the first thing to realize about Latin styles is that most of them are going to fall into one of two categories. I think Americans tend to group samba, bossa nova, bembe, clave, all, like any Latin term pretty much falls into the Latin category for Americans, but they actually fall into either an Afro-Cuban category or a Brazilian category. And they really don't have a whole lot to do with each other. There isn't any overlap between the styles. So it's important to keep those separate, and we'll be talking about both of them. The first one I want to talk about is the Afro-Cuban, a few Afro-Cuban styles. And the rhythm that most Afro-Cuban styles is based off of is called the clave rhythm. And the clave is actually an offshoot of an older African rhythm called the Bembe, which was a ceremonial rhythm. It was an all-purpose ceremonial style that they used for weddings and funerals and births and birthdays and divorces and what have you. And it's in 6/8 time. They didn't think of it in 6/8 time, but when you notate it using a Western notation, it's in 6/8 time. And it sounds like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can see how that's in sort of a triple meter. The Cuban clave is actually in a duple meter, but it was derived from that African bembe. So the Cuban clave sounds like this. This is the clave pattern. I'm just using the hi-hat for timekeeping purposes to put it in context. But if I alternate between the 6/8 bembe and the duple meter or 2/4 clave, you can see pretty obviously how the clave was kind of evolved from the bembe. So I'll kind of alternate in the same pulse. So here's the bembe. Here's the clave. And if you hear them side by side, it's even more obvious. So that's the origin of the clave rhythm. And like I said, the clave rhythm is what most Afro-Cuban styles are built around. So another important thing to realize about the clave rhythm is that it has two components. One is the 3, and the other is the 2. It kind of has two halves. So what we just played, what we just heard, was bop, 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 bop. So it has that 3 component and the 2 component, and it's important to realize that they are interchangeable. You can play the 2 component first. So instead of bop, 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 you'll get 1, 2, 3, 4. Bop, 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 bop. That's typically used in a lot of dance styles. They'll use that, what they call the 2/3 clave. You'll hear the clave referred to in 3/2 or 2/3, and that is just referring to which half of the clave you start on. What we've been talking about so far is a form of the clave called son clave, and there's another variant of it called rumba clave, where the third note of that group of 3 is moved over just 1/16th note. So instead of zone clave, rumba clave sounds like this. And rumba clave is the one that's typically used when it's flipped around and you play 2/3. So 2/3 rumba clave would sound like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. So, now that you've got that clave rhythm down, and you've mastered both the 3-2, the 2-3, the son, and the rumba, now you're ready to add some right-hand patterns, and there are a few different options you have in mambo or salsa styles that you'll hear. The first one, and the most common, is called the Cascada pattern, and Cascada is Spanish for shell. It's called that pattern because traditionally, in traditional instrumentation, the timbale player would play this pattern on the shell of the drum with a stick. And that Cascada rhythm is as follows: 1, 2, 3, 4. With the clave pattern, it sounds like this. If you want to switch the clave around and start with the 2-3 clave, that half of the Cascada has to switch as well. So you'll get. So those are two of the three components that comprise a lot of Afro-Cuban styles. The third component is the bass pattern. It's sometimes referred to as follow bass, where if you listen to Afro-Cuban music, the bass never plays on the downbeat. If the pulse is here, you'll hear the bass player playing 1, oh, 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 oh. It'll play on the of 1 and the and of 2. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and. So you're going to mirror that with your bass drum, and it's good to practice this with just with the bass drum alone at first. 1, 2, and 1, 2, and 1, 2, and 1, 2, and. Then, if you want to keep pulse with your left hand, with your left foot rather, on the hi-hat, you can keep a quarter note pulse. Add the clave. And when you're ready, add the Cascada. So that's the Cascada pattern. Another option you have are a couple of different bell patterns that you can use that you can play on cowbell. Or if you don't have a cowbell, you can play them on like the bell of the ride cymbal. The first one is called Mambo Bell. It's called the Mambo Bell pattern. And alone, it sounds like this. With the clave, and by the way, that bass pattern, that follow bass pattern we talked about is called the tumbao. With the clave and the tumbao, it sounds like this. There's another cowbell pattern you can use called the bongo bell, which is a little bit more straight ahead. With the clave and the tumbao, sounds like this. So those are some more up-tempo Afro-Cuban styles. A more down-tempo Afro-Cuban style still uses the components of the clave and the tumbao, but they're just slowed way down, and it's called the Chacha style. So we're about here, if we're thinking quarter notes, it's almost a half-time for Chacha. So whereas our quarter note was here, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a, all the note values are going to be doubled basically for Cha-Cha, and we'll be talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The clave will fit in this way. With the tumbao. So what's your right hand going to do? It can't just play eighth notes because that's boring. If you look at an Afro-Cuban ensemble, you'll probably see a guy, especially for a cha-cha style, you'll see a guy playing what's called the güiro, which is that wooden instrument that looks kind of like a fish, and you scrape it with something that looks kind of like a chopstick. But you can kind of emulate that sound. The pattern that the güiro plays is so the way you can emulate that on the drum set is with the hi-hat, you can play a buzz stroke and 2 single strokes. Add that to the clave and the tumbao. So there's the cha-cha. The last Afro-Cuban pattern that I want to talk about is going back to the Bembe, that original African rhythm that we started out with. And this was a style that was kind of popularized in the 50s and 60s by jazz drummers like Elvin Jones and Art Blakey. You'll hear it referred to as like a 6/8 Afro-Cuban or an Elvin Jones type Afro-Cuban. So we'll start with that Bembe pattern again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The right-hand pattern is usually played on the cymbal or the bell of a cymbal and sounds like this. The bass drum is going to play the first note of every bar with a pickup note before it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. The hands together sound like this. Again, you can use your left foot as the timekeeper. Just play that pulse on the hi-hat. And if you add the bass drum, it sounds like this. You can also play that on the cowbell. So there's the basics of a few Afro-Cuban styles. Again, in Doug Allwater's book, there are many more variations and notation of those rhythms and some more detailed explanation of those. So I highly recommend picking that up. So all of those patterns we just talked about are in the Afro-Cuban category. We are now going to travel over the Atlantic Ocean and go to Brazil. And a lot of terms, the term clave has worked its way into referring to some Brazilian music. The Afro-Cuban clave that we just played, that rhythm does not appear in Brazilian music. However, the word clave does appear in Brazilian music because both in Portuguese and in Spanish, the word clave means key. And in that sense, each style has kind of a key rhythm around which styles and patterns are built. Like we said, in Afro-Cuban music, it's the clave. But in Brazilian music, it's a rhythm called Partido Alto, which has been referred to as the Brazilian clave. But it's important to recognize that the Afro-Cuban clave that we just talked about does not appear in Brazilian music. So the Brazilian Partido Alto rhythm that Bossa Nova and Samba and some other Brazilian styles is built around sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's similar to the clave in that it has two halves that are sort of interchangeable. We started with a downbeat, and then the second half of that rhythm starts on an upbeat. So if you can also start with an upbeat. I'll demonstrate starting with the downbeat first and then starting with the upbeat. Here's the downbeat half, starting with the downbeat half. Here's the upbeat half. 1, 2, 3, 4. So It's interchangeable in the same way clave is, which is partly responsible for the confusion. So that's the Partido Alto rhythm, and the first pattern that we're going to talk about that the Partido Alto rhythm is part of is the Bossa Nova. And it's a very straight ahead beat. You can just play eighth notes on the hi-hat or the ride cymbal, and the bass drum is going to play an ostinato pattern. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4. The hi-hat, if you play the right hand on the ride cymbal, the hi-hat can play 2 and 4, so your feet will sound like this. You can also, like I said, play the right hand on the hi-hat. So just straight eighth notes. If you put straight eighth notes on the right hand with the Partido Alto on the left hand, it'll sound like this. Add the bass drum. If you move that over to the ride cymbal, move the right hand to the ride cymbal, and you can play 2 and 4 with your left foot on the hi-hat, that'll sound like this. There's also, that's kind of an authentic bossa nova with the Partido Alto pattern. There's also what's called real-world bossa nova, which is employed more in Latin jazz, Brazilian jazz, and it's much more improvisational in that you don't have to stick to that strict Partido Alto rhythm. You can kind of improvise a rhythm with your left hand, and that'll sound something like this. So that's a little bit more improvisational. It gives you a little bit more freedom. The other Brazilian pattern that I want to talk about, or one of the two others that I want to talk about, is the samba pattern, which is a popular up-tempo Brazilian style, and it still employs the Partido Alto pattern, only at a much faster tempo. It's typically written in 2/4, so the Partido Alto will be written in eighth notes and 16th notes as opposed to quarter notes and eighth notes. So I'm going to play eighth notes on the hi-hat, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and at that tempo, this is what the Partido Alto sounds like. At that tempo, it's obviously very difficult for most of us to play straight 16th notes like you would on the Bossa Nova. You can only get so fast with that. To kind of get around that, drummers have started employing a pattern that just takes a few 16th notes out here and there, but it still mirrors the Partido Alto pattern, and it sounds like this. So that is I typically use that when I'm playing that on a ride cymbal. That leaves my left foot free to kind of keep time because it's a very syncopated rhythm, and for your bandmates or for your listeners, it can kind of be hard to follow. If you're looking for an easier rhythm to play, there's kind of an Americanized ostinato pattern that's played for samba, and it's simply 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a... With the Partido Alto and the feet parts, it sounds like this. 2, 3, 4. The more syncopated pattern with the 16th notes taken out here and there sounds like this. 2, 3, 4. And again, with that sort of American ostinato, you can move that over to the hi-hat and still play 2 and 4, closing on the hi-hat, and get an open hi-hat on 1 and 3. Add the Partido Alto and the bass part, it sounds like this. And the cool thing about Brazilian music is, again, it really gives you license to improvise a little bit. A lot of times when I'm playing a samba tune, I will abandon both of those hand patterns and just improvise a little bit within that style. So I'll demonstrate that. For a few bars, I'll play the strict Partido Alto rhythm on the rim shot or the snare drum, but then I'll get a little bit more improvisational with it, and you can see how you can have more freedom but still stay within that style. So 1, 2, 3. So as you can see, you can employ all types of different left-hand techniques, not just that rim shot, but get a regular snare sound. You can use buzzes, rim shots, to really kind of spice up that style. The last Brazilian pattern that I want to talk about is, we just talked about the Partido Alto rhythm, which is, like we said, the rhythm that these styles are based off of, but there's also a pattern and a style that's referred to as Partido Alto. And basically, it breaks up that pattern. Instead of the left hand playing that pattern alone, it breaks up the pattern between the left hand and the right foot bass drum. And the important thing to realize about a Partido Alto style is that, like we said, we can switch the two halves of that Partido Alto rhythm, and the Partido Alto style is going to start on the upbeat half. So the Partido Alto rhythm broken up between the bass and, or I'll do it just with the snare drum first, starting on the upbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4. The way it breaks it up between the bass and the snare sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So, again, you can play the Americanostinato along with that. And another important thing to think about when you're playing the Partido Alto style is that most American styles, jazz and rock and what have you, are used to playing an accent. Like on a new phrase, you'll play an accent on 1. You'll play a cymbal crash on 1, the beginning of a new phrase. But since that Partido Alto style is starting on the upbeat, it's starting on the E of 1, that's where your accent is going to be. So instead of playing 1, 2, like if you do a fill into a new phrase, instead of playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, you're going to want to hit that big accent on the E of 1, like so. 1, 2, 3, 4. Another variation on that Partido Alto rhythm is to move one of those snare notes back 1/8 note, so that you get a little bit of a halftime rock backbeat feel, and that sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. That can also translate, you can play that on a ride cymbal. If you want to get more of a street feel for your samba, and I say street feel because this music all originated at Carnival. It's parade music. So there's a couple of like street patterns that you can play that kind of abandon the Partido Alto but are still in the samba category. And it's going to take a little bit of coordination between your hands. But the ride cymbal, right hand, is going to play 1 EN, 2 EN, 1 EN, 2 EN. Left hand will play 1 E, a 2 E, a 1 E, a 2 E. Together they sound like this. To get a more authentic feel, you can kind of accent the of every beat on the snare drum. And you just add that with the samba feet, 1, a 2, a 3. So those are the Brazilian styles I want to talk about. And just to review what we've talked about, we have 2 categories, Afro-Cuban and Brazilian. Bembe, clave, tumbao, mambo, cascada, Chacha, all of those are under the Afro-Cuban category. When you get over to the Brazilian category, you're talking about Bossa Nova, Partido Alto, Samba. Those are all under the Brazilian category. And again, Doug Allwater's book goes into great detail and about the history of these rhythms. So I highly recommend picking that up. I'd like to thank Bosphorus Cymbals for making these wonderful cymbals that you've heard. If you would like to pick some up, I encourage you to go to bosphoruscymbals.com. You can learn more about how they're made. And a great website to buy them is cymbalsonly.com. They have huge stockpiles of Bosphorus cymbals and sound clips of all of them. So I would also like to thank onlinedrummer.com for letting me do this. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.